Hello everyone, welcome to BCBA Exam Prep. In today's lesson, we're going to explore two very important concepts in applied behavior analysis: response differentiation and stimulus discrimination. These concepts are fundamental to understanding how learning occurs in ABA, and they also appear frequently on the BCBA certification exam. In this video, we'll break down how differential reinforcement shapes behavior, how responses become more precise over time, and how stimuli begin to control when behavior occurs. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to clearly distinguish between these two concepts and recognize them in exam scenarios. To understand response differentiation and stimulus discrimination, we first need to understand how learning typically occurs in ABA. At the beginning of learning, a learner may produce many different responses. Some are correct, some are approximate, and others may be completely unrelated. Through reinforcement, the environment begins to select which responses will become stronger. Responses that produce reinforcement increase in frequency, while responses that do not produce reinforcement gradually weaken. This process is known as differential reinforcement, and it is one of the core mechanisms that drives learning and behavior analysis. Differential reinforcement means that one specific behavior is reinforced while other behaviors are not reinforced. Imagine a learner producing several possible responses: behavior A, behavior B, and behavior C. If only behavior A receives reinforcement, that behavior will increase in frequency over time, while the others decrease. This creates what we call a behavioral hierarchy, where the reinforced behavior becomes more likely to occur. For differential reinforcement to be effective, we need clearly defined behaviors, meaningful reinforcement, and consistent timing. These components ensure that the learner can detect which response is producing reinforcement. Response differentiation focuses specifically on differences among behaviors. In many learning situations, the learner may initially produce multiple possible responses. Through differential reinforcement, the correct or target response is reinforced while incorrect responses are not reinforced. Over time, this process leads to increased precision and accuracy in behavior. So the key idea here is that learning occurs through selecting the correct response among several alternatives. This is what allows behavior to become more refined and more effective over time. Response differentiation typically develops gradually. At first, the learner may produce a wide variety of responses. The instructor then consistently reinforces the response that most closely matches the desired behavior. Because reinforcement is delivered selectively, the correct response begins to occur more frequently. At the same time, incorrect responses decline because they no longer produce reinforcement. On the BCBA exam, when you see a scenario where reinforcement is applied selectively to different responses, that is usually an example of response differentiation. A classic real-world example of response differentiation is speech development. Early in development, a child may produce many different vocalizations, such as ba, da, or ma. Parents or caregivers tend to reinforce sounds that resemble meaningful words. For example, when the child says something close to mama, the caregiver may respond with attention or praise. Over time, the reinforced vocalization becomes stronger and more consistent. Eventually, the child produces the correct word reliably. This is differential reinforcement shaping the child's vocal behavior. Now let's shift our focus to stimulus discrimination. Unlike response differentiation, which focuses on differences among behaviors, stimulus discrimination focuses on differences among stimuli. In this process, one stimulus signals that reinforcement is available. This stimulus is called the SD, or discriminative stimulus. Another stimulus signals that reinforcement is not available. This is called S delta, or S delta. As learning occurs, the behavior begins to occur in the presence of the SD, but not in the presence of the S delta. In other words, the stimulus begins to control when the behavior occurs. Stimulus discrimination develops through repeated exposure to different stimuli paired with different reinforcement outcomes. During training, multiple stimuli are presented in alternating trials. Reinforcement is delivered only when the correct response occurs in the presence of the SD. When the same response occurs in the presence of the S delta, Reinforcement is withheld. Over time, the learner detects this pattern. As a result, the behavior increases when the SD is present and decreases when the S delta is present. This process establishes stimulus control. A common example is color identification. When the red card is shown, the learner says red and receives reinforcement. When the blue card is shown, the same response does not produce reinforcement. Over time, the learner says red only when the red card appears. The stimulus now controls the response. Stimulus control occurs when behavior reliably occurs in the presence of a particular stimulus. The SD signals that reinforcement is available, and therefore the behavior becomes more likely in that situation. Importantly, stimulus control develops through a consistent history of reinforcement. When a learner repeatedly experiences reinforcement following a behavior under certain conditions, the stimulus begins to guide responding. As stimulus control strengthens, behavior becomes more predictable and consistent. This is a key goal in many ABA teaching procedures. The SD signals that reinforcement is available if the correct response occurs. The S delta signals that reinforcement will not occur. Over time, the learner responds in the presence of the SD, but not in the presence of the S delta. A key exam point is that SD is defined by reinforcement history, not just by appearance. Now let's compare response differentiation and stimulus discrimination. Response differentiation focuses on how a behavior is performed. The learner selects the correct response among multiple possible responses. Stimulus discrimination, on the other hand, focuses on when a behavior should occur. The learner responds differently depending on which stimulus is present. Both processes rely on differential reinforcement, but they shape behavior in different ways. Together, they help produce accurate, flexible, and adaptive behavior. Another way to think about this distinction is that response differentiation shapes behavioral precision, while stimulus discrimination shapes contextual control. Response differentiation selects the correct behavior among multiple possible responses. Stimulus discrimination determines when that behavior should occur. In many teaching programs, both processes are operating simultaneously. For example, a learner may need to produce the correct response and also produce it in the correct situation. Understanding this distinction is essential for both clinical work and exam preparation. On the BCBA exam, these concepts are usually tested through scenario-based questions. You may be given a description of a teaching interaction or intervention. Your task is to identify the underlying behavioral principle. Some questions focus on stimulus control, while others focus on differential reinforcement across responses. To answer these questions correctly, you need to analyze the reinforcement contingencies described in the scenario. Pay attention to whether the change in behavior depends on stimuli or responses. A helpful strategy for exam questions is to follow a simple decision process. First, identify whether the scenario describes differences among behaviors or differences among stimuli. Next, examine the reinforcement history. Ask yourself whether reinforcement depends on the type of response produced or on the stimulus that is present. If behavior changes across stimuli, the concept is stimulus discrimination. If reinforcement selects one response among multiple responses, the concept is response differentiation. This decision process can help you quickly identify the correct answer. There are several common mistakes that test takers make with these concepts. One common trap is confusing behavioral differences with stimulus differences. Another mistake is misidentifying the SD simply based on appearance, rather than reinforcement history. It is also important not to ignore reinforcement contingencies. Remember, reinforcement history is what establishes stimulus control. Whenever you encounter a scenario question, always ask yourself, what is actually changing the behavior? The answer to that question usually points you to the correct concept. These principles are widely used in ABA therapy. Discrete trial training uses differential reinforcement to build accurate responses. Natural environment teaching helps learners respond appropriately across different stimuli. Error correction procedures also rely on reinforcement patterns to guide learning. Together, these methods support effective skill acquisition. Understanding these concepts has several important clinical benefits. First, they improve skill acquisition because reinforcement strengthens accurate responses. Second, they reduce learning errors by providing clear consequences for behavior. Third, they strengthen stimulus control, ensuring that behavior occurs in the appropriate context. Finally, they support generalization, allowing skills to transfer across settings, people, and materials. When applied correctly, these principles significantly improve the effectiveness of behavioral interventions. Let's review the key ideas from today's lesson. Differential reinforcement is the mechanism that drives learning by strengthening desired responses. Response differentiation shapes the precision of behavior by selecting the correct response among alternatives. Stimulus discrimination guides when behavior should occur by linking responses to specific stimuli. On the BCBA exam, always determine whether the scenario focuses on behavior variation or stimulus variation. That distinction will usually lead you to the correct concept. In this lesson, we've explored the relationship between differential reinforcement, response differentiation, and stimulus discrimination. These concepts explain both how behaviors become more accurate and how they become controlled by specific stimuli. Mastering these ideas will not only help you succeed on the BCBA exam, but also strengthen your ability to design effective teaching procedures. If you'd like to continue practicing these concepts, try applying them to different teaching scenarios and reinforcement contingencies. Thanks for watching, and keep studying behavior analysis.